Let's get to your article. So this is great, Reed. It's in Common Dreams right now. It's called The Treason of the Ruling Class. And the subheading is, they have destroyed our capitalist democracy and replaced it with a mafia state. The ruling class no longer has legitimacy. They have destroyed our capitalist democracy and replaced it with a mafia state. What the Roman philosopher Cicero called a commonwealth, a res publica, a public thing, or the property of a people, has been transformed into an instrument of naked pillage and repression on behalf of a global corporate oligarchy. We are serfs ruled by obscenely rich, omnipotent masters who loot the U.S. Treasury, pay little or no taxes, and have perverted the judiciary, the media, and the legislative branches of government to strip us of civil liberties and give them the freedom to commit financial fraud and theft, the loss of control over systems of rulership, the misuse of all democratic institutions, the electoral process and laws to funnel money upwards into a handful of oligarchs while stripping us of power ominously means that the ruling elites can no longer claim the right to have a monopoly on violence. Violence employed by police and security agencies such as the FBI, which have devolved into occupying forces to protect the exclusive interests of a tiny ruling criminal class, exposes the fiction of the rule of law and the treason of the ruling class. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience, Stokely Carmichael warned. And if your opponent is bereft of a conscience, then state violence is inevitably met with counter-violence. Tyranny takes the place of reform. The danger of widespread sectarian violence in America is now very real. How long can you expect people to watch their children go hungry? How long can you expect people to watch their loved ones suffer and die because they can't get medical care? How long can you expect people to be abused by lawless police and a court system designed to railroad the poor into jails and prisons? How long can you watch the rich profit from your misery? I would prefer that our revolution eschew the poison of violence, which I know too intimately from my 2 decades as a war correspondent, but I also know that when everything around you conspires to crush you, the only way left to affirm yourself is to destroy not only the structures and institutions that have oppressed you, but often yourself. Okay, so let's stop there. Let's talk about that. So you say the ruling elite has lost all legitimacy and their monopoly on violence. So go ahead and explain that a little bit more.
Well, because that defines government in its modern term, and that is that it has the monopoly on violence. It alone has the right to use violence. But it can only essentially claim that right if the government represents the consent and the will of the governed. Once it no longer does, then its legitimacy to monopolize violence is mute. And at that point, it becomes tyranny. And that's, I would say, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a kind of form of corporate totalitarianism. Both parties are complicit. And therefore, the violence that they are using in the name of, combating unrest and keeping peace is essentially to protect the interests of this tiny, rapacious criminal class that runs the country. And so and I think that in the streets, especially among the millennials, they get it. This is very different from the 1960s, because in the 1960s, the country was affluent enough that you could get thrown out of college, or you could be a protester and then go on and make a middle class living. You see figures like John Kerry, who's, his moral height was Winter Soldier, and his powerful testimony in front of Congress, and it's been all downhill from there. He's now one of the richest people in the Senate. So even the black leadership class was bought off. But now, because there's been such a monopolization of wealth, nobody can get bought off. And these kids out in the street are fully aware that they have no opportunities, nowhere to go, that this is, Biden is, there's a whole paragraph in that story on everything Biden's done, including passing all of the crime bills and death penalty bills and expanding police forces and capital crimes and everything. It was all Biden. And he wasn't a bystander, by the way. Biden sponsored and pushed this legislation. So, but the millennials and the kids, they get it. That these people have, these oligarchic rulers, this corporate oligarchy has stolen their future, has thwarted any possibility of them finding a meaningful place within the society, of actualizing themselves, of affirming them, of allowing them to pursue whatever their dreams are. It's all been shut down. So it's very different from the 60s, and therefore far more ominous, because as corrupt and awful as the government was in the 1960s, there was still enough of a liberal class within the Democratic Party to be able to respond, not in significant ways, but enough to ameliorate the worst of the suffering. Now that's gone. There's no. So I look at this situation as kind of unprecedented within American society. And let me just say, this was originally posted on Robert Scheer's site, Scheer Post, which after we were all fired, I'm not making this up, after we all fired from Truth Dig, you set up with his Social Security checks. So I know you have a deep reach in the billionaire class, so maybe somebody out there watching can go write him a check. And we all write for it. It's kind of a mom and pop thing. But anyway, it was originally on Scheer Post, yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that Scheer Post had started.
Yeah. Him and his kids do it.
Fantastic. That's great. That, Bob Scheer doesn't need a billionaire. So do you think other people see the same thing that you're talking about that the state has lost their monopoly on violence and that it's legitimate? So, because I keep thinking to myself, if you see 6 cops running down a dark street at you, you better protect yourself. So, I mean, I don't know what what am I supposed to do as a citizen if I see 6 cops running at me in full riot gear with clubs, and they're gonna maybe even kill me. They might, do whatever. So when do people get to use violence against the police preemptively? Because you can see, well, like for instance, we saw that horrible video of those two college kids in Atlanta. Like, it's horrific. They break their windows. They tase both of them. They break the girl's wrist. The guys unbelievable violence I couldn't conceive in a game, in a video game, was being perpetrated on camera to 2 kids who did absolutely nothing. And by the way, now all those 4 cops have been charged. But my point is, so now if you see a cop and he tells you to stop, we saw people running cops over now because cops have been running crowds over and doing whatever they want. So now people are legitimately fearful of the police when they see them. And is it legitimate for them to use violence against police?
I wouldn't use the word legitimate. I would just, and this was the point of the piece, that when you shut every avenue for reform down, when people recognize that they're completely trapped, it is inevitable that they will use counter-violence. Now, that often can be, and usually is, I think, self-destructive, but it's the only way left. It is the ruling elites who determine the configurations of resistance. And if they don't offer the possibility of addressing the suffering and creating some kind of restitution, then that's what they're going to get. I'm not going to put a moral quality on it. I'm deeply opposed to violence, having been around a lot of it. On the other hand, I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were completely surrounded by the Serbs, who were shelling the city with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. It was a trench system, literally. We knew that if the Serbs broke through past those trenches, a third of the city would be slaughtered and the rest would be driven into refugee and displacement camps. And that wasn't conjecture, because that's what they did in Vukovar. It's what they did in the Drina Valley. So at that point, you pick up a gun. I get it. We were being bombed in Sarajevo. People were not sitting around in basements having long discussions about pacifism. At the same time, that doesn't protect you from the poison of violence. And that's what I worry, that the ruling elites are so tone deaf, so myopic, so out of touch. And let me put Joe Biden at the top of the list, that they won't respond to what has really become my quote in the article, Barbara Ehrenreich, about how being poor in this country is one long emergency. But of course, with COVID, it's gotten so much worse. The moratoriums on evictions are about to be lifted. The stimulus checks, which were a joke, won't exist. Unemployment benefits will run out. They're saddled with debt. The hunger is now becoming hunger. Well, what was it? 1 out of 5 children are already were food insecure before this thing. Tens of thousands of people are lining up at food banks. Yep. I mean, what do they think is going to happen? How do they think people? Of course, they don't. They are so out of touch. And that's, I've watched this. I've watched it all over the world. It's a kind of frighteningly familiar scenario.
So let's move on to, you talk about the causes, and you say that the uprising in the streets of American cities are not only about the wanton murder by police of yet another person of color, but the frantic fight to wrest back power over our lives. They go far beyond police brutality, a daily reality for those trapped in our internal colonies, where 1,100 citizens are murdered by police every year, almost all unarmed. The uprisings are fueled as well by the seizure of the institutional and structural mechanisms that once made some form of equality, always imperfect and always colored by animus towards the poor and people of color, even possible. So, you're just kind of highlighting the fact that, this is more about the police killing unarmed black people in broad daylight and no repercussions. This is, as we've been saying, this is about just an oppressive oligarchy that is just strangling people. And so do you think that because Dylan Ratigan had predicted we're going to become like Brazil, and that eventually we just accept it, and that, in we slide into authoritarianism, and that they keep like 80 to 85 to 90% of the people poor, not starving, but right on the brink, and that's how they keep control.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, half the country already lives in poverty or near poverty, a number that's going to exponentially rise with 40 million unemployment claims and estimated, these are government statistics, 25% unemployment by this summer. Look, the capitalist class wants to keep the working class in a state of constant distress so that it expends all of its energy to subsist, to survive. That's to their benefit. It makes unionizing impossible because there's always desperate people willing to work for substandard wages and be abused because it's all they have. So look, I think we already in huge parts of this country. I go all over the country for the books that I write, and usually the poorest pockets of the country. I wrote a book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which was literally written out of the poorest pockets of the country, including Camden, New Jersey, which is about an hour away, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States. We never see it. You never visually see it. The stories are untold. No. I mean, even Camden, you drive, Camden's on the river right before Philly. They built the throughways up over the Camden, so you don't even drive through the city. And that place has, literally streets that are abandoned with trees. There are trees growing out of what used to be the public library. I mean, hundreds of abandoned buildings. It's the rot is extensive. Detroit, Newark, Cleveland. I mean, it's endless. And the capitalist class has every intention of using forms of draconian control, like militarized police, like mass incarceration, like the revoking of our constitutional rights by judicial fiat, in order to use the iron boot. I mean, look, all of the animus towards Bernie Sanders on the political spectrum was not any kind of radical. Right. He wasn't even a great New Dealer because he wouldn't take on the military. They couldn't even handle Sanders. As soon as Obama, who, as Cornel West correctly said, was a black mascot for Wall Street, uttered a few very tepid words of admonishment towards Wall Street, they turned on him. and all flew their private jets to Boston to inaugurate Mitt Romney, which didn't work out. But so yeah, it's the capitalist class, which is global. It's supranational. It has no loyalty to the nation state. Ralph Nader calls them traitors, and that is what they are. They don't want to give up their obscene wealth. What Bezos has, since COVID, increased his wealth by $34 million. Billion. I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry. And you had on your show the other day, I mean, the billionaire class has collectively increased their wealth by $434 billion. These people profit off of our misery. I mean, literally, they do.
So why?
They're not going to change that.
So I know. So what happened the last two times stuff like this happened? Teddy Roosevelt came along, broke up the trust, gave some rights to workers, stood up with them. And then a little while, a couple decades later, it was FDR. And he told his rich friends that if you don't give people some of your money, they're going to take all of your money, which had just happened in the Russian Revolution. And so where is that guy to tell those people? Wouldn't that be, you would think it would be Barack Obama. Barack Obama's, I just saw a tweet that he's about to give a speech today about what's happening. And I hope he shakes his finger, wags his finger at looters from his 49-acre estate on Martha's Vineyard. But anyway, where are the rich people? Where are the leaders who tell the elite class, like, hey, you have to give people at least health care, a living wage, and some debt relief so they don't riot and take over the country? Where are those people?
They're locked out of the system. I mean, the Democratic Party, when in the 90s, when it began taking corporate money under Clinton, also made war against its own liberal wing and pushed everyone out. And so anybody with a conscience, anyone who stood up and spoke on behalf of the working class was purged. A lot of people don't know the history, and that's what pushed Ralph Nader to run. Ralph Nader knows corporate power better than any other American, has been fighting it longer and with more integrity than any other American. He said there's nothing left in Washington to work with. And his idea was, and I supported him, I was a speechwriter, is you pull 5, 10, 15 million people into a third party and you create pressure. That's how politics work. I mean, it's just basic. Surrendering every election cycle to corporate Democrats, and again, history has proven this, makes it worse. You got to make them come to you. You've got to pose a threat. You've got to instill fear in them, and you've got to stand for something. And if they don't give it to you, you don't give them anything. But of course, the whole third party, the two parties have conspired to. After Ross Perot got 19%, that both the Democrats and Republicans said that's it. And so I lived through the harassment. I mean, the people who really went after Nader was the Democrats. They made it almost impossible to do a third-party run. They challenged all of his voting lists, not because there was anything wrong with him, but because they were trying to push him up to over $1 million worth of legal fees to defend it in court. So, the two parties are completely complicit and work together to essentially shut out any real leadership. You have people like Ralph, Jesse Ventura. I mean, there are people, Howie Hawkins, who's now running as a Green. I mean, they're there, but they're locked out of the system. They can't get in the debates. Remember when Dennis Kucinich, they had these arcane rules. You had to be in the top 5 or something. I mean, and finally Kucinich made it, and they just changed the rules because they didn't want Kucinich to talk about health care.
They did the same thing to Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want her to talk about the foreign wars.
Right.
Don't you think? Did you find it? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, nobody would want to debate Ralph Nader either.
Yeah. Yeah, of course not. Of course, that's why they handcuffed Jill Stein to a chair at the debates for 8 hours. It wasn't because they weren't afraid of her. They were. They were afraid of her message and getting out. And that's why, by the way, used to be the League of Women Voters took care of the debates.
Yes,
they got rid of that. The Democrats and Republicans formed a corporation, and they not only get to choose all the rules, but they get to choose who asks them questions.
Right,
which is amazing.
No, and it's even worse than that. They get corporations to sponsor it. So, like, the for-profit insurance companies and pharmaceuticals are actually sponsoring the debates, which shows you why you get all these idiots on CNN with their little flashcards asking, Bernie Sanders, the kind of, the questions that their corporate masters want asked, and accusing him implicitly of, not being able to pay for it and all this kind of stuff.
You bring up Bernie as I'm sure every time I talk to you, I'll ask you a question. I'm still gobsmacked at his lack of doing anything in this moment. It's as if, the way I say it on this show, it's as if the Lord himself created this moment for Bernie Sanders and his policies and his movement, and Bernie just won't do anything. Isn't it stunning to you?
No, we had this discussion before.
I know.
Because Bernie has always carried water for the Democrats. I mean, I think I mentioned the last time I was here, he was campaigning for Clinton in '96 after NAFTA. After NAFTA, after the omnibus crime bill. And he knew what he was doing. He so he's been completely consistent in terms of buckling under pressure from the Democrats and carrying water for the Democrats. That's what he's always done.
So now, I think that you mentioned briefly in the article about the 3 solutions or 3 things that has to happen. Or now, do you think that this is another one of those leaderless revolts or protests? There's no leader, and they don't have a clear set of demands. So what needs to happen right now to make some kind of demand on the establishment?
Well, that's the problem. They can deal with episodic eruptions around the country. But the fact is we don't have, it's not so much even a leader, but there's no clear ideology. Even the Wobblies, which, okay, they had Joe Hill and Big Bill Haywood, but it was a pretty egalitarian organization. But we don't have what we had in the 30s or what we had before World War I, which were these powerful progressive, and let's not write out the Communist Party. It was a very important element in terms of challenging the power elite. Why did Roosevelt do what he did? It's because he was scared. He was scared of the organized left. And unfortunately, in the United States, there's been a very effective campaign to stomp out the left and not just stomp out the left in an organizational form, but silence the voices of the left. And that worries me. That worries me because you are going to go either way, revolution or tyranny at this point. But all of the organized force, including the ideology, which is the form of Christian fascism, it comes now from the right, not from the left.
Yes. And as we speak, Nancy Pelosi is trying to expand Trump's buying powers. So she's not. So again, this idea that they oppose Trump is just a fake. It's a phony idea. It's propaganda. Nancy Pelosi and Trump are in lockstep on most things. And they even gave him money for his border wall, if you want to know how much in lockstep they are. And she's right now, as she's reading from the Bible and calling him every name in the world, she's behind the scenes trying to expand his spying powers so he can have more power to spy on his enemies or anybody organizing against him. And they won't report that on the news.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the whole news industry is, especially let's talk about the broadcast industry. I hesitate to even call it news. I mean, I have strong critiques of my old employer, the New York Times, but I still read it. But I don't waste my time watching CNN or any of that stuff. It's info entertainment. It's vapid. It's just the news version of ESPN. Basically, that's all it is.
So I'm watching. I watch just because I do the kind of show I do. So I like to get horrible clips of them being horrible, so I could show everybody how horrible they are. And I'm watching the last couple of days, and every MSNBC, CNN, and I haven't been turning on Fox because that's just too easy. That's shooting fish in a barrel in a situation like this. But they all bring on their expert panels, and who's on their expert panels? Fucking former policemen. They're all former cops sitting around talking about the problem of policing in America. Where's Medea Benjamin? Where am I? Where is the leader of Black Lives Matter? Where is nowhere anyone? It's always former police. They brought on experts, and they never bring on anybody who's going to have a critical thing to say about the police. It's amazing to see that happen. And are you still amazed at that? No, I guess not.
Same thing with war. I mean.
Yes.
Or Clapper. I mean, Clapper should be in prison.
Yes.
Brennan. Petraeus, all of these people. Look, I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I speak Arabic. The whole lead up to the invasion of Iraq, I was watching, as you say, these so-called experts who'd never been to the Middle East, were linguistically, historically, and culturally illiterate, didn't know anything they were talking about, but they spun the dominant narrative, so they gave them a seat. It's not, again, it's scripted. It's not about any real, honest debate or discussion. It's about buttressing conventional power and the conventional narrative. That's it. That's what they do. And if you buck it, you're out. I mean, Phil Donahue, Jesse Ventura, and at that, I'm going back to the Iraq War. They're gone. I mean, they're disappeared. They're disappeared.
Ed Schultz dared even cover Bernie Sanders, and they fired him for doing that.
Yeah.
So all the people who are hosting shows at MSNBC followed the rules, and they obeyed commands to not cover Bernie Sanders. That includes Rachel Maddow. That includes Chris Hayes. When they were given the order, they went along. And when their colleague didn't and got fired for it, they shut up. That's what $30,000 a day does. And I'm not saying I would resist it. I'm saying no one's making the offer to me yet. Let's talk about infiltrators into the protests, which I think is really important. People don't realize. I've pointed out cops are often responsible for setting fires and doing property damage. But let's start with COINTELPRO. Can you tell people what that was?
Right. So this was a kind of secret plan that was revealed by activists who actually broke into an FBI office outside of Philly and got the documents and sent them to the Washington Post. But it was a heavy infiltration. And let's remember now that the resources the state has are far expanded from what they were in the 1960s. And they would carry out all sorts of dirty tricks, in terms of surveillance, in terms of black propaganda, in terms of threats, in terms of turning public opinion against organizations. That was COINTELPRO. But of course, now what's happening internally, which we can't see, is far greater and more pernicious. And I used to tell the kids in Zuccotti Park, you just have no idea the resources the state has. And the state, I mean, this again, I've got to go back to the media. I mean, let's be clear. Almost all these protests, 99% of the time, are peaceful protests. But the images they hit you with is that target burning or that brick going through a window. And so that becomes the dominant image of the protest. And that is really a way to demonize the protest. I've been very critical of the Black Bloc. Antifa is split between those who support kind of property violence or, attacking property and those that don't. But let's talk about the Black Bloc. I know a significant portion of those people are cops. First of all, they get to cover their faces.
Yeah.
But the idea is you want to make the wider public frightened of the movement so that you diminish the size of the movement. It makes it easier to control. And they're there in force. I mean, there are large numbers of undercover people. We've seen it with Muslims. If you go back after 9/11 and look at all of the quote unquote terrorism trials, it's all these dead ender, these poor kids from Somalia who can barely read, who get enticed by FBI agents who come in and show them how to make the bomb and give them the wires. And then, and that's literally 90+% of all the terrorism cases. And that's the same here. I mean, they provoke it. It's intentional. And they know what they're doing. You can read counterinsurgency manuals. They're online. And that is just a fundamental tenet of any counterinsurgency operation, is that you demonize the movement, you make people frightened of it, and then it's easier to crush. And I know that's happening, across the country.
So I've been having these Twitter spats with people who want to delegitimize these protests by saying it's, Antifa and just focusing on Antifa. And so I keep saying, well, I would like to join Antifa. Can you tell me where I send my dues? Can you tell me where these this guy Scott Adams or something? He tweeted out that you should leave your phone at home because the FBI is onto Antifa. If you're going to an Antifa meeting, you should leave your phone at home. And I'm like, where are these meetings? I would love to go to one. Who's the leader? Can I email him? Do they have a headquarters? If Antifa is so powerful that they're controlling every city, big and small, inside this country right now to the point that they can shut them down, you'd think they'd be easy to find, but they're hard to find. Now, I know that a thing called Antifa exists, but not in the way the right wing wants us to believe, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and also the idea that they're terrorists. I mean, on the spectrum of terrorism, they rank along, of world terrorist groups. They're the equivalent of the Boy Scouts. They're tiny groups. We dealt with them in Occupy. They're certainly not behind the protests. Look, did you see Susan Rice blaming Putin for the protests?
Yes, of course. So did John Cusack.
Oh, really?
I mean, Russiagate Russiagate is officially a diagnosable mental illness.
That's right. They've got all the Russians showed up in Minneapolis, and no, it's just that's what despots do. They seek to blame any kind of legitimate dissent on a foreign power and turn you into an enemy of the people. That's as old as I don't know. It's been around forever, but it's just insane. Or blaming it on Antifa. It's a way by the ruling elites to deflect attention from their own responsibility for what's happened.
Do you know anything about Antifa? I know very, very. I was in an Antifa quote unquote protest in Portland about a year ago. It was the Proud Boys and then Antifa showed up. It was mostly theater. It was really theater. Nobody there I was afraid of at all.
Right, it's mostly theater. Yeah, I've written about them. They don't like me, and I don't like them too much. I actually don't have a problem. I mean, Ishmael Reed, who's a great friend of mine, lives in Oakland. He was very angry at Antifa for showing up in Oakland during Occupy and smashing the windows of local businesses. He says, I don't have a problem with smashing windows, but drive up to La Jolla, where Romney lives, and smash his windows. And that's what's, by the way, interesting about this uprising is they're not burning their own neighborhoods. Fifth Avenue in New York got shellacked. Now that's different. And it shows a kind of class consciousness. Which I don't think that property destruction or attacking the police I understand it, but that's not the same as to condone it. I don't think that that's going to be effective. I mean, I think what's effective in a kind of dark way is that idiot Trump taking peaceful protesters outside the White House and using pepper spray and rubber bullets to remove them so he can stand in front of a church in his, welcome to fascist America speech. That's really, that will ignite the protests.
Well, he actually lost Pat Robertson even on that one. So that's the exact demographic he's actually targeting with that. Trump thinks he's reaching and solidifying. And Pat Robertson came out with a video saying, no, Mr. President, no, he was like, that's not cool, is what he said. And I didn't know Pat Robertson started smoking marijuana. But it was nice to see him say, it's not cool, Mr. President. And so the very people he's targeting, he's losing. And the problem, though, is that if Trump loses, we get Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And but before we get off on anything else, I want to just go back to this one more thing about infiltrators. I like when Ferguson, I remember I was on the Young Turks when the Ferguson fires happened, and I was on the panel, and they were like, oh, why would these people burn down their own neighborhoods? And I'm like, I bet you half of those fires are insurance fires, and the other half were started by the cops.
Right.
And the people on the panel at the Young Turks looked at me like a Martian just came down and shit me out of an egg. And I'm like, where did you guys grow up? Do every one of you grow up in a cul-de-sac? Is your middle name cul-de-sac? Have you guys ever met a cop in your fucking lives? Anyway, So I just want to make people realize if you see a fire. Oh, by the way, there's a video tape that I have in my computer. I don't have it at the ready, but of these young black kids. I think they're in Dallas or Atlanta, and they found these crates of bricks in the middle of the street. They just there's no construction project, but there's a crate of bricks just sitting there, and they didn't take the bait. And it happened in San Francisco too.
This right here.
Yeah, they put them there.
This the setup.
They put them there on purpose,
Y'all know where
bro.
we at.
They gonna set them on right up on the route.
Y'all know what building this is right here. I ain't even gonna say what name it is.
Hey, where do them bricks go to? Where do them
This
bricks
is
go
setup.
to? Where do them bricks
We
go
gotta
to?
do better.
Ain't no damn construction.
Gotta do better.
Ain't no damn construction around here.
I see.
Ain't no damn construction around here. You just gonna set a pallet of bricks right there. Oh, okay.
Listen, I did jury duty 3 months ago. Y'all don't keep no bricks right there. Do better. Do better. I see you.
They do this all over, right? Where they put bricks and they try to incite violence in that way.
Yeah. No, that's what they want. They because if a crowd becomes violent or there incites a clash with the police, then you have to remember there are large numbers of people who won't go into the street. Undocumented people who can't get arrested, elderly people, disabled people, children. You wash away a huge part of the demographic. I think one of the things that frightened the state in occupying Zuccotti the most was on the weekends when all these white couples would come with their kids in strollers walking up and down the street. And you saw the same kind of attempt to demonize Occupy as you're seeing here. And it also deflects attention away from the fundamental questions about police violence, structural and institutional racism. It gets you talking about something else, rather than what you should be talking about.
Do you think a leader will emerge, that there will be demands made and met? Do you think anything good will come of this?
Well, you can never tell. I mean, I learned that in Eastern Europe in the revolutions, where all of the leaders, whether in East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Romania or anywhere, well, in Czechoslovakia it was a little different because you had Havel, but they did emerge in some places, and they didn't in others. It's impossible to tell. I hope so. I think these kids have got it. I think they've figured it out. I don't think they're buying the game. I think they're very politically astute. And there's also subterranean movements that the mainstream press is totally unaware of. I remember after Occupy, I did a debate with the anarchists, and it was packed. It was in New York City. It was hundreds of people, and it was live streamed all around the country. And I thought, this is huge in terms of the churning of ideas and stuff, but it's completely below the radar. It's unseen. And Alexander Berkman writes that. He writes about, revolutions. The old system crumbles and decays. It appears, the facade remains, and nobody sees it. And he said it's like boiling water, that the wider society in a kettle, the wider society doesn't see it until the whistle goes off. So certainly that churning, that boiling is there, that ferment, but you can go any way. I mean, in the 1930s, Europe went one way, we went another. That's impossible to predict. That there are capable leaders out there without question. I've met a lot of these kids. I'm old, so probably in their 20s or 30s. They're really impressive. They've been locked out of the mainstream, but that doesn't mean they're not capable of immense leadership.
I see movements. I just saw a video of the leader of the Sunrise Movement, which is an environmental group, and she put out a video touting her excitement over the task force that she's been appointed to between Bernie and Joe Biden. And I immediately thought, oh, God, another co-optation of a movement. And that's exactly what that is. Would you agree?
Yeah. All those movements, MoveOn.org, they've all been co-opted. It's political naivete. They play to their ego. They give them a little money. It's kind of sad how easily people are bought off. Randolph Bourne and Emma Goldman and Jane Addams all wrote about this. Eugene Debs with Wilson, who did the same kind of thing. How fast people, but then there are those who won't, and they're out there too. So let's hope they prevail.
Hey, you mentioned Eugene Debs. I saw the other night Bernie was doing a live stream dedicated to the memory of Eugene Debs.
Yeah, Bernie. There's quite a wide divide between him and Debs. Remember,
Yes.
Debs went to prison.
Went
I'd
to
like to see Bernie go to prison.
Okay. So, Ed, do you have any, any advice to people in a time like this?
No, I mean, I think people. I think my sense is that people out in the street understand that this issue is far, far beyond the indiscriminate, lethal violence of police, and that what's coming within the next few weeks and months is going to make life exceedingly difficult for, at this point, the majority of Americans. And unless we rise up against this system, they will use the very draconian forms of control to really create a world of masters and serfs. I mean, when your government monitors you 24 hours a day, which they do, we're the most photographed, monitored, eavesdropped, watched population in human history, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. When you look at how they treat the most vulnerable within our society, especially with the prison system, you see exactly what they want to do to the rest of us. And I think that awareness or consciousness is far more widespread, especially among younger people who have seen every avenue shut to them, are many of them struggling with tremendous amounts of debt peonage, student loans, and everything else. I think they get it. This is really an existential fight. It is about the overthrow of a corporate oligarchy. And I'm not naive enough to tell you we're going to succeed. But if we don't succeed, then we are going to see established in the United States a very dark and frightening kind of corporate tyranny. And finally, I would just say that resistance is a moral imperative. It doesn't in the end matter whether we win. As I've often said, I don't fight fascists because I'm going to win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And that allows us to at least retain our dignity, our integrity, our honesty, and our own power in the face of the monolithic power of the state.
Did you ever just think of moving to France?
I lived in France. I have a Swiss passport and a Canadian wife, so I'm covered.
Ah, nicely done. Okay. Well, everybody, we urge you to check out Chris's writing at the Common Dreams at Sheer. What is it now called? The Sheer
Post. Popular Resistance runs it. It's on this one's on Common Dreams. You can read it anywhere you want.
Okay. All right, Chris Hedges, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. You're always so generous. And,
all right.
And we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Jimmy.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?